At the end of February, the US and Israel launched joint airstrikes against Iran, killing the country's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei. Many, including Donald Trump, thought that would be the end of the government as we knew it, and that even if the Islamic Republic of Iran stayed in place, a new leadership would emerge that was ultimately more amenable to the interests of Washington. And yet, in the almost 2 weeks since, the precise opposite has happened, with the Iranian state showing genuine resilience and, for now, still able to project force beyond its borders. So what precisely is happening? And how is Iran exceeding expectations? Vali Nasr is a professor of international affairs and Middle East studies at Johns Hopkins University in the United States. He's also the author of Iran's Grand Strategy, A Political History. That was published last year by Princeton University Press. Earlier today, I spoke to Professor Nasr and started by asking him whether the war so far had gone to plan for Washington and Tel Aviv.
Perhaps it's gone more to plan for Israel than for the United States. Israel expected a long campaign. It wanted to bring down the Islamic Republic, dismantle its military capabilities, and even perhaps break down the Islamic State, the state in Iran as a whole. I think President Trump expected a much shorter, cleaner war, that they would assassinate the supreme leader, a number of other leaders in Iran, bomb some strategic sites. I think there would be a new leadership in Iran, and very quickly the war would end, and he would be able to declare victory and claim that he brought Iran out from the cold and changed its trajectory. So I think for the United States, the fact that this war has gone so long, that it's got messy, that it's impacted global energy markets, that it's impacted the Gulf countries, and it has spread much more, has been a surprise.
And what about for people like Pete Hegseth or others within the sort of the retinue of Trump? They would be more sympathetic, I presume, to the desired outcomes of Israel. And that presents a strange problem, doesn't it? That you don't necessarily have unity even within the American side, let alone between these two allies.
On the American side, essentially, you have only one decision maker, which is President Trump. I think everybody around him just follows his lead, particularly the Secretary of Defense, who really does not have a strong policy position of his own and parrots essentially the president's wishes much more forcefully. And Israel essentially focused on converting one person to the war. This was not an effort to change American policy, to sell it to the American public, to make a case that would be debated and over months before you arrived at the idea of a war. There was one person that Prime Minister Netanyahu needed to focus on and convince, and that was President Trump. He decided on the war. He didn't think much about how to justify why February 2026 had to be the start of a major war in the Middle East. And he didn't think through really what the consequences would be. And as a result, he was surprised by the fact that the war has unfolded not according to his imagination.
And why was he so amenable to persuasion by Netanyahu? There were those memorable scenes, of course, during the 12-day war last summer, where you had at the end of it, clearly sleep-deprived, traveling between one location and another by helicopter. I think at the time he even said he hadn't slept for 24 hours, where Trump memorably said they don't know what the F they're doing. He was clearly upset with Tel Aviv as much as Tehran. It's a strange trajectory, isn't it, to go from that in June last year to February this year, where he's amenable, persuadable to a course of action which is so radically different, not just to preceding US foreign policy, but also his own stated political positions.
I can only venture guess as to why he was persuaded by Prime Minister Netanyahu. Perhaps there's domestic pressure from a lot of other donors and politicians in the US, like Senator Lindsey Graham, who are amenable to Israel's position. Perhaps he thought, as Secretary Rubio has said, that Israel may go to war anyways, and then the United States would be forced to go in. But I think when the demonstrations happened in Iran, President Trump got overexcited that the regime is about to fall. And this would be a moment where he could claim for a major American foreign policy victory, that he is the American president that ended the Iran problem for the United States, that closed the book on the Iran issue, and he technically brought in Iran in from the cold. And so he immediately was ready to go to war, to the point that I think Prime Minister Netanyahu had to pull him back and say, well, you know, the forces on the ground are not yet prepared for proper war on Iran, and you have to first build the armada in the Middle East, and then we go to war. And then his reasons for war kept changing, like he wanted to support the protesters, then he wanted a nuclear deal, then he wanted regime change. But ultimately, I think he was persuaded that there was a big moment in Iran. This was the moment to break the Islamic Republic completely. And so he was sold on going to the war without really thinking through about alternate scenarios that may unfold. And, Aaron, this is part of the problem in Washington, because the policy process, you first say, what's your problem? And then they give you certain solutions to deal with their problem, military and otherwise. And then they would walk you through that all the costs and all the possible things that could be the outcome. But in the United States, President Trump resolves on a decision, and then everybody else rushes to implement it without actually really going through all the scenarios that can happen. So when he says, I was surprised that Iran took the war to the Gulf, I mean, that was on the table. The Iranians had said they would do that. The Gulf countries knew that would happen. So the fact that he was surprised about it means that no discussion happened in the White House about that particular scenario.
You just said there something which hasn't surprised you and which was quite predictable. Much of what has happened in the last week, 2 weeks has been, of course, predictable. I'm going to ask a question which is, the opposite of that in some respects. What about the response by the Islamic Republic has surprised you? I don't just mean militarily. I mean politically, in terms of how it's communicated to the rest of the world. As somebody who is very apprised of these matters, you've written a very informative book about all of this. What has surprised you? What didn't you expect?
In a way, I'm not surprised, because they are still, fighting the battle of resistance, if you would. But what surprised me is the determination in Iran that this will be the last war they're going to fight with the United States. That either they would go down or they would absorb whatever the US and Israel can throw at them, but then they would essentially force a recalculation on the United States such that when this war ends, it would not be a return to the status quo. That's not where they want to go back. And I think the audacity and the determination they've shown to pursue this strategy has been somewhat surprising to me, even though everything about it is very much in the DNA of the Islamic Republic.
And what's changed? Because we had last year, of course, at the start of the 12-day war, these very targeted assassinations of senior people within the Revolutionary Guard, the country's political and military establishment. We, of course, had the pager attacks with Hezbollah. And for a decent period of time, it looked like Iran and its proxies, as well as the upper echelons of the political establishment in Tehran, they didn't look particularly competent or effective. And that continued all the way through to the start of this. And of course, Khamenei died at home. People will say, well, he wanted to be martyred. I personally buy that argument. But nonetheless, since he has been killed, since Khamenei's death, Iran's response, militarily at least, has been much more decisive, calculated, and dare I say, violent. What has changed? Because it does feel like we're looking at two different countries almost.
So that might be a second surprise here, that how quickly Iran adapted itself after the 12-day war, and how fast they internalized the lessons from that war. So one lesson was that, okay, they barely survived exactly because they had a state that was built to be decentralized, or at least IRGC had been built to be decentralized. So then Khamenei made sure that the entire state is built in a way to survive decapitation, that he delegated authority across the various institutions. They deepened, if you would, the decision-making at much, much lower levels so that, you could take out leaders, but the system can continue to function. It looks like they prepared for, with food and varieties of things, that this might be a long war. I think they rebuilt their missile capabilities, adjusted it, improved it, and then built drone capability, which has caught the US by surprise, all of which in anticipation that the war would return. And how quickly they did this, I think, was surprising. and also the lessons that they learned in the 12-day war, that in the 12-day war, it was the United States that asked for a ceasefire, they believe at Israel's behest, not Iran, that the US and Israel will try to land a massive punch up front to try to knock you out. But if you don't get knocked out, they're not really capable of fighting a long war. And I think this calculation they made, which is proven very, very effective, that it is not America and Israel's offensive weapons that will decide the war. How many jet fighters, how many missiles, Tomahawk missiles, how many bombs. It's their defensive capabilities that will decide the war. That was also true of the 12-day war. So Iran has prepared itself to absorb Israeli-American hits, but then is following a strategy to deplete their defenses. And we're seeing this happen in the Gulf, running out of Patriot missile stocks, interceptors are running out. And I think the sense in Iran is that actually the real war starts after the 10th, 11th day, when their stocks have been depleted. Now, there is a narrative in the West that Iran's missile batteries and launchers and stockpiles has been damaged. But there may be a surprise here that actually after they've really depleted the defenses, the offense will really actually start at that point in earnest. So all of these came out of the 12-day war. So they've proven themselves to be dysfunctional in many ways as a state, in managing varieties of things in Iran, economy, et.cetera. Their intelligence was penetrated by Israel. But at another level, within a 6-month period, they've proven themselves to have adapted and prepared for this war in ways that actually has, to a good extent, turned the tables on the United States.
So do you buy the argument that Khamenei was a handbrake on competent, effective military responses? I mean, because that's one read on it. It sounds like you're not saying that. It sounds like you're saying something quite different. But again, as a relative layperson, which is what I am, although I learn a great deal from people such as yourself and reading great books like the one you wrote, it does feel that, particularly after 2020, Khamenei, who when he was killed was 86, he was an older man, and his strategy of strategic patience was really undermining Iran's ability to oversee national self-defense. I mean, it sounds to me like you don't buy that argument.
Well, I think the infrastructure that this regime is fighting with was built by Khamenei. The entire missile program, the entire drone program, all of this happened under his watch. So he wasn't micromanaging, but he delegated this authority to IRGC to build these capabilities. Where I think he was restrained or decisions that he made became effective, one was that he was never committed to building a nuclear weapon. And he supported this idea of having a civilian program that you could somehow persuade the West that it's civilian and they will allow you to have it. And that doctrine proved to be false. And now that he has gone, and particularly with him, his fatwa has died. In other words, there's no more standing fatwa that says nuclear weapons are against Islam. His son may follow a very different strategy with Iran's nuclear program. And also, Khamenei, we know what is the restraint, for instance, on the range of Iranian missiles. I mean, it's very clear that he prevented IRGC to build missiles that could be up to 5,000 kilometers range. And in fact, in one public speech, he said that the IRGC are unhappy with me for restraining them on this. And the commanders he chose, which Israel continuously eliminated, many of them were the less hardline commanders that might have been much more risk-taking in terms of offense. But I think after the end of the 12-day war, I think he also became determined that the primary task was preparing for the next war. And whatever Iran needed to do to be prepared, it should do. So it wasn't restraining IRGC's ability or desire to build many more drones and missiles, or to divest authority from himself across the Iranian state in a way that it would be managed. It was Khamenei that elevated Ali Larijani to be sort of the uber bureaucrat to manage the system, even in his absence, or to create multiple redundant decision-making bodies so that if one is eliminated, another one is there. And they obviously, they lost commanders here, but most of the commanders they lost were actually in the meeting with Khamenei. Some others have been killed here and there. But clearly, he also oversaw creating a system that allows the leadership of Iran to operate in hiding much more effectively. That was the case in June.
So just to repeat, people heard you say that, but I think this is really important. Many people, of course, are familiar with the fact that Iran didn't develop, well, many of our viewers and listeners certainly, are familiar with the fact that Iran didn't develop nuclear weapons because of Khamenei. He was a handbrake on the development of an explicitly, weapons-based nuclear program. But that is quite extraordinary that Iran, I believe their most effective long-range or medium-range missiles are the Shahab 3s. You're welcome to correct me there. You're saying that actually Khamenei stopped a missile program that would have potentially been able to go beyond the Eastern Mediterranean, maybe even to Western Europe. And this is the man that our political class in this country has been cheering on the death of. Is that just, I just want to make sure you're saying that. So the IRGC wanted weapons that could potentially go beyond the Eastern Mediterranean. Khamenei said, no, we can't do that.
Yes, I mean, in a way, he was a hardliner. He was anti-American. He was not a friend of the West, but he also was far less risk taker and far less confrontational than actually what's coming after him. I mean, we'll see how his son would be, but it's very clear that even in June and now, the IRGC leaders that Israel eliminated were the more, and this is a comparative term, of course, the more moderate, like than the ones that have replaced them. The new commander of IRGC is far more risk-taking and dangerous than the one that Israel killed in the Supreme Leader's house, and much more. And the one that the Israelis had killed in June was, more moderate than the current one. And so what Israel has achieved essentially is a generational change in IRGC and now at the top of the Iranian system. And contrary to what Trump thinks, that decapitation brings sort of an Iranian version of Ahmad al-Shara, the Syrian leader, somebody who's willing to put a tie on and come and shake his hands. It's the opposite is happening. You're getting military commanders that are much more willing to take the fight to the United States. These are commanders now that came out of the wars in Syria and Iraq, where they were confronting the United States frontally, and they are obviously are much more willing to replicate what they did in Syria and Iraq now at a broader basis with the U.S. So IRGC has not become more moderate as a consequence of the decapitation. Is actually becoming a much more risk-taking and in a way perhaps more radical institution. And generally, Aaron, the decapitations and always makes military organizations more dangerous because the new generation that comes up actually escalates to prove itself. It doesn't go the other direction. And ultimately, wars shape regimes. And this war, the way the Iranians see it, this is the last war they want to fight with the US. And now this is turning into a war of survival of Iran. It's not about the regime anymore. So when the United States and Israel bombard Iran's historical heritage in Isfahan, in Tehran, when President Trump says that the borders of Iran are in question and they may change at the end of this war, and I'm going to arm separatists to break away from Iran, this becomes then an existential moment for the country. And that's not the point at which you're going to get more moderate forces coming to the front or pragmatic forces coming to the front. It is the ones that are willing to fight and die and wage a battle to save the country that are going to become the more prominent voices. So for now, this war has hardened Iran, which is exactly the opposite of what President Trump imagined, that somehow the war would soften Iran. It actually has had the opposite effect.
I want to come back to this idea of domestically at least, the reformist faction within Iran becoming completely discredited. I think this is a really important story which very few people are talking about. But quickly, in response to everything you just said about decapitation not working, about a new generation of IRGC leadership wanting to escalate things, being more offensively minded, being more risk-loving, I am very critical of Benjamin Netanyahu. I think he's a war criminal, fundamentally, or at least he should answer for war crimes. Nonetheless, he is a very accomplished politician. He's been at the top of Israeli political life for decades. He served in the military. Did none of this dawn on him? The idea that, well, if you take out that top layer of the IRGC, that actually you'll get a more assertive, aggressive organization?
Well, I mean, in Israel's history, they've done this with Palestinians and in Lebanon. But it sort of didn't phase them out. I mean, when earlier leaders of Hezbollah that were killed, the very first one was replaced by Hassan Nasrallah, which was much worse than the one they killed. Or many leaders of the Hamas or Palestinians over the years were more offensive-minded, more hardline than the ones that replaced. But Israel is actually has never been after a policy of moderating its enemies. It's been after a policy of destroying its enemies. So it's operating on a very different agenda. Now, Iran is the biggest fish that Israel has gone after. And I think Israel's aim was not to make the Islamic Republic more moderate, the way President Trump thinks. Israel is after breaking the state and Islamic Republic altogether, and perhaps even breaking up Iran altogether. In other words, removing Iran as a factor that would threaten Israel or stand in the way of Israel. So if the outcome in Iran is civil war, chaos, something like what happened in Syria, that's actually better for Israel, because Syria as a broken state in civil war was never a threat to Israel. And Iran would be out of the Middle East calculation for a generation, let's say. So I think they thought that, if you bomb Iran enough, if you kill enough leaders, if you encourage the population to rise up, if you arm the Kurds, and the combination of all of these things would produce a Syria in Iran. And then, Iran would collapse onto itself. So I don't think they were looking for moderation. But I think the result is also surprising to them, that this state is just not falling apart. And they have to bomb a lot more and kill a lot more layers before they actually are able to break the Islamic Republic. And so now, I think yesterday there was rumors in Israel that they now have a new list of targets to be assassinated in Iran, from the new supreme leader to the new commander of IRGC to the national security advisor. But even that will not do it, I believe. I think there is more coherence to the Islamic Republic than they estimated. And also, the Iranian population, I think, is not going in the direction that they thought they would. There is worry among Iranians about the future of the country, not about the future of the Islamic Republic. And that is making for a very different kind of political reaction to this war than President Trump or Prime Minister Netanyahu assumed.
Yeah, I want to ask you about the political direction, because this is really important, both within Iran but also amongst the diaspora, and how this relates to reformist politics within the country. Vali, a friend of my father's, I was just speaking to my dad the other day, a friend of my father's has always been very critical of the government. He was former military. He just is not a fan. He wanted Iran to lose at the World Cup, and he loves football. One of those people, right? One of those people. And since this has kicked off, he has done a complete 180. That's not to say he's supportive of, this or that, fatwa or ayatollah. He's not even a practicing Shia. But for him, the images of plumes of smoke by Isfahan, or Gulistan Palace being destroyed, or children being pulled out of rubble, that has made him completely change his view on Tehran and what needs to happen, particularly the role of foreign intervention. Now, of course, there have been these quite, how can I put this? Ubiquitous scenes almost in places like the United States and Canada, less so here, but here as well, of the Iranian diaspora celebrating the assassination of Khamenei, but they're sort of still going. A question: Is there a sort of polarization within the Iranian diaspora? And for people inside Iran who are having to live with this, whatever their personal views on the government and its performance, how do they view those people celebrating? Because, of course, there are many people who want to change the regime in Iran as well. And then finally, what does this all mean for the reformist faction? Because, of course, there has been a big internal faction within Iranian political life, which has been seeking rapprochement, which wants a normalization with, the United States and quote unquote the West. It does kind of feel like they've been discredited, I mean, if you're a Pahlavism, that makes sense. If you're pro-government, that makes sense. They're in this strange middle position, which frankly has no basis in reality.
I mean, first of all, politics of the kind that people outside Iran, inside Iran want, of challenging the regime, a very clear, are you with the regime or are you opposed to it, really works in peacetime. That's why the major protest in Iran in January happened 6 months after the ceasefire in June. The reality is that in the middle of this war, increasingly, as Iranians see this war, not on the war on the regime, but a war on Iran, not only in terms of collateral damage being on Iran, but that the deliberate targeting of the infrastructure of schools, hospitals, historical heritage, of talking about breaking up Iran, I think nationalism kicks in. And so I think particularly inside Iran, where people are living it, this is much more evident that, yes, people don't like the regime. They didn't like Khamenei Sr. They're very afraid of Khamenei Jr. There is no love for the Islamic Republic. And Iranians have not forgotten what happened in January with the massive bloody crackdown. But right now, that's not the paramount issue in front of them. The paramount issue is the survival of the country. And so the political division of saying, are you for the regime or against the regime, becomes convoluted when the next layer is put on it. Are you for war or are you against the war? And then on top of that, there's another layer added, which says, are you for the breakup of Iran or are you for the survival of Iran? And so in Iran, this picture is becoming more and more complicated, that Iranians inside Iran are not unidimensional in approaching the Islamic Republic. And right now, the political, are you for the regime or anti-regime, is subsumed by the much larger issue of, are you for the war or end of the war? And are you for division or breakup of Iran or your priorities to protect it? Whereas among the Iranians outside, there is a segment which sees this in very unidimensionally, which is, the regime should be removed at all costs, even at the cost of damage to Iran's historical heritage, even at the cost of civil war, even at all costs, right? But that's not a view that I think is right now on the ascendant. I think this is becoming increasingly a minority view, particularly because this kind of a view is expressed publicly under an Israeli flag, and with chants of "Thank you, Trump," "Thank you, Bibi," which is mind-boggling. In fact, it's mind-boggling to non-Iranians. I see many Turks, Pakistanis, etc., just sort of say, "How could the people be cheering for the bombing of the country and thanking the aggressor?" And I just don't think that this kind of a view, in a certain fog of January massacre may have held, but that ultimately it could be a view that can be compatible with fundamental love of your country, right? Forget about the regime. I mean, we have to also think 50 years of the Islamic Republic is less than 1% of Iran's history. Iran has survived, as a civilization, as a culture for 7,000 years. It has been in this nation-state boundary form since 1500. And, your hatred of the Islamic Republic, if it's at such a level that it overshadows your love of the country, I don't think that's a sustainable political view. And I think the high point of convergence of this particular diaspora with people of Iran was in January. But I think the war is separating their paths very quickly. I mean, we're seeing large crowds in Iran gathering against the war, against what is happening to Iran. And we're not seeing great crowds in the streets of Iran trying to overthrow the regime. That may happen again. I'm not saying that the Islamic Republic's in the clear, but in this heat of the moment, that's not the prevailing sentiment.
So, Vali, this point you make about, Pakistanis, Turks, Arabs, I mean, I've had this as well. People messaging me on Instagram or whatever saying, what on earth? This is bizarre. This is really important, by the way. In 1980, when the Iran-Iraq war kicks off, you have Reza Pahlavi actually volunteering, saying, I want to fight for Iran against Iraq. Now he's saying, bomb, bomb, bomb Iran, effectively. And I think that really does show how disconnected a lot of the diaspora is from the country right now, as you say. But nevertheless, I mean, Vali, this is really historically unique. And I think one sort of way of looking at this is through the prism of the Cultural Revolution in China, which is the mid-1960s. It's crazy. The Cultural Revolution is an absolutely crazy moment in Chinese history. Nobody in Chinese civil society or overseas, or we don't have any record of it anyway, was saying, please bomb China, right? Nobody was saying that. Even after Tiananmen Square, nobody was saying, please, United States, Britain, the Western powers, the G7, please bomb China. Nobody was saying that. I can't think of many other examples where a diaspora has behaved in this manner. It does seem peculiarly Iranian. Any thoughts on that? Because it is so unusual.
It is, and it is peculiarly Iranian for no better reason that, as you said, you haven't seen any other diaspora do that. Although there's some people in Venezuela or Venezuelans or Cubans in Miami, egged on the Trump administration to invade Venezuela. But they were, those countries also have a kind of different kind of a sociological makeup, let's say, between those who migrated and those who stayed. But I think, it's a product of two things. First of all, there is a segment of the Iranian diaspora who really, for a better way of putting it, really wants to be white. It doesn't want to identify with the global South. It wants to belong to the mainstream of American, European society. And so embrace of Israel, embrace of Zionism, being opposed to the Gaza war, supporting the MAGA movement, essentially is their way of integrating. And they want an Iran that would actually support their view of themselves as not being Arab Muslim, but being basically mainstream Western. And so it's an imagination of an Iranian identity that basically says Iran's history stopped in the 7th century when the Arabs came. We belong to that period. That's Indo-European. And also mainstream Americans, mainstream Europeans are pro-Israel, they're anti-Gaza. So we're like them. So that phenomenon is very much there and is very much tapped into this particularly monarchist movement in Iran. The second factor, which is very different from the time of the Cultural Revolution, is social media. I mean, we're also dealing with, over a decade of essentially weaponization of Iranian public inside and outside of Iran, who were obviously primed because of their anger at the Islamic Republic, but they've also been bombarded, if you would, with Iran International, other television stations, and also social media. So what we're seeing is not that dissimilar to what I witnessed in the United States in 2016, where people who were watching Fox News and reading particular kind of social media basically had a view of Democrats, of immigrants, of a variety of things in the United States, which was kind of to mainstream Americans became kind of completely outlandish. I mean, believing, for instance, that without a shadow of doubt that Hillary Clinton was running a child sex trafficking ring out of a basement of a pizzeria in Washington, D.C., which led somebody to drive all the way from North Carolina with a shotgun to free the children, right? So some of that is also at play. In other words, the diaspora has also been mobilized and weaponized, particularly with the help of Israel. I mean, in fact, there's studies by Haaretz, et cetera, about how much Israel used this. And also within Iran as well. And not to say that the Islamic Republic has behaved in a way that doesn't deserve opposition. But the diaspora, in a way, is also the product of a very effective long-term political campaign. Not so much that it dislikes the Islamic Republic, but in the way in which it's reacting to the war, the kind of worldview that it has embraced is also a product of our times.